Hey guys, tonight we're curling up under the velvet gloom of a foggy Victorian sky. Soot drifting like lazy ghosts past flickering gas lamps. The sound of gentle rain taps against the window panes, soft, persistent, like a memory you haven't quite placed. You're wrapped in a worn woolen blanket, maybe not your own, in a drafty London townhouse with creaky floorboards and a fireplace that's just starting to crackle. Sleep hovers somewhere nearby, but in 1880, it doesn't come easy. You're restless, and not just from the cold. Imagine you're in a world where people believe that lying awake too long at night could warp your morals. A time when staying up too late wasn't just annoying, it was practically scandalous. You probably won't survive this era's bedtime rituals. Not unless you've got a stomach for raw onions and a fondness for staring into a fireplace until your eyes blur. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your city and local time in the comments. I love to imagine where in the world you're listening from. As the rain falls, now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't remember how long you've been pacing, barefoot, across the worn rug in your small rented room. Maybe you never even went to bed. That clock on the wall, the one that ticks loud enough to be heard 2 streets away, says it's almost midnight, and still not a yawn in sight. Victorian London doesn't sleep well. At least, not the way we imagine sleep today. In this soot-draped century, you don't get a solid 8 hours under a gravity blanket with whale song and melatonin gummies. No. You scratch your head and wonder if you're simply too moral to fall asleep. Yes, morality. Because in this period, sleep isn't just about rest. It's about virtue. A sleepless night might mean your soul is uneasy. Maybe you've committed some unnamed impropriety, or maybe you've just eaten the wrong kind of pie. Either way, it's your fault. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly slept less than we do now, or if they just thought they were worse at it. Some records hint at segmented sleep patterns where people drifted off early, woke in the dead of night to read or pray, and then returned to slumber later. Others suggest this was romanticized hogwash meant to justify night owls. Either way, one thing's clear: they were preoccupied with sleep. You might hear the rain outside, but you also hear your neighbor in the next room coughing into a handkerchief. Likely tuberculosis. Or maybe he's just tried one of the new coal-based sleep remedies. Either way, sleep is not coming easily tonight. Your options limited. You could try a cup of warm milk. Or you could follow the new suggestion published in the Household Almanac. Wedge a slice of raw onion between your pillow and your ear, and whisper a prayer to Saint Dymphna, patron saint of sleepless souls. You wrinkle your nose. The idea of sleeping with a vegetable next to your face feels absurd. But then again, so does staying awake all night fretting about your moral standing in society. You're tempted outside your window. A lamplighter trudges by, extinguishing the last of the gas lamps for the night. His boots splash through puddles, and you wonder if he sleeps any better than you do. Probably not. His job starts before dawn. Back in your room, the fire is still low. You consider lighting it again, but coal is expensive, and you're already behind on rent. Still, you gather a few twigs from the basket, careful not to wake the downstairs landlady, and feed the embers. A soft crackle returns, echoing through the silence like a sigh. Victorian insomnia isn't rare. It's almost fashionable. You remember reading about famous sleepless figures. Charles Dickens, for example, often wandered the streets of London at night when he couldn't sleep. He claimed the exercise soothed his nerves. Of course, it also gave him material for his novels. But that's Victorian multitasking for you. Your boots are by the door. You could go for a walk, like Dickens, but it's raining, and there are rats. Instead, you sit by the fire, cross-legged, and stare into the orange glow. This, too, is a cure. A doctor in 1864 wrote that patients suffering from exhaustions of the mind should spend at least 1 hour per evening looking steadily into a controlled flame. It was thought to realign your spirit, or at least bore your eyes into closing. As you sit there, your mind begins to drift, not toward sleep just yet, but toward memories. Your aunt's insistence that moonlight was poisonous. The herbalist on Whitechapel Road who swore by roasted poppy seeds. The time you tried counting sheep and got distracted by wondering who first thought sheep were numerically relaxing. The rain continues its soft percussion. A pigeon coos drowsily in the rafters. Somewhere down the alley, a drunk sings a lullaby off-key. You shift closer to the fire and close your eyes for a moment. Not asleep yet, but getting there. They say Queen Victoria herself suffered from sleeplessness after the death of Prince Albert. Her physicians prescribed rest, of course, but also repetition embroidery, prayer, and listening to the same song played gently on a pianoforte each evening. The repetition, they believed, lulled the mind into a docile rhythm. You wish you had a pianoforte. Instead, you reach for the folded copy of the penny-illustrated paper by your bedside. Its edges are soft from overhandling. There's an article about a man who claims to have cured insomnia with goat's milk and silence. You're skeptical, but intrigued. Victorian sleep advice, after all, ranges from the charming to the baffling. One physician swore that tying a red ribbon around your big toe would dispel brain heat, a supposed cause of sleeplessness. Another suggested placing a Bible under your pillow, not for spiritual comfort, but to even out spinal pressure and steady the humors. Historians still argue whether these ideas were believed in earnest or simply tolerated out of desperation. Either way, they fill the long, echoing hours of the Victorian night. The fire pops softly. You smile, just slightly. You're still awake, but not entirely. The room feels warmer now, the shadows a little less stern. The onion idea no longer sounds so strange. Maybe tonight you'll give it a try. You shift slightly on the creaky floorboard, feeling the warmth of the small fire as it throws a golden halo across the room. Shadows from the iron grate flicker across the wallpaper, dancing like sleepy phantoms in long nightgowns. You exhale, not quite a yawn, closer to a sigh weighted with turn-of-the-century anxiety. In the flickering hush of your little room, you reflect on how seriously the Victorians took the matter of sleep. This wasn't just about feeling rested. It was about moral fiber, social reputation, and even the health of your soul. To be chronically sleepless was to invite suspicion. Were you harboring some unspoken guilt, engaging in behavior that upset the nerves? Did you perhaps drink too much black tea or spend your afternoons in idle thought? Victorian doctors, with their formidable beards and fondness for Latin phrases, weren't exactly known for nuance. Their medical texts brimmed with grave pronouncements on the dangers of sleeplessness. One popular theory posited that lying awake too long led to a softening of the brain, followed swiftly by melancholia, gout, or hysteria, depending on your gender and station in life. Historians still debate whether these warnings reflect genuine scientific belief or were more about social control, reminding people to stay obediently within their roles, to sleep when told, and dream only in moderation. Either way, the underlying message was clear. Sleep was virtuous, and wakefulness after dark was suspicious, and yet insomnia crept in regardless. You picture yourself now as one of many, the clerk with ink-stained fingers, the laundress with cracked knuckles, the chimney sweep coughing soot from his lungs, all tossing in their narrow beds, wondering why their minds wouldn't hush. The problem was common enough that even newspapers printed sleep tips right next to shipping schedules and scandalous letters to the editor. Tonight, you try to remember the advice from one such article you read last week. Something about a calming beverage made from lettuce. That's right. Boil a whole head of lettuce until limp. Then sip the broth slowly, ideally while seated on a cushioned ottoman, facing east. You're not entirely sure why the orientation matters. Perhaps the rising sun imbued the lettuce with fortitude. You have no lettuce, just the onion from last night's dinner. But you remember another suggestion, grazing the mind. They called it replaying gentle thoughts like old songs, recalling details, sensory impressions. You close your eyes and try the sound of boot heels on wet cobblestones, the musty tang of coal smoke, the peculiar itch of wool pajamas at the neck. In the world of Victorian sleep, these sensations are not irritants, they are anchors, tethers to the world of physical presence, to the gentle surrender of the waking mind. But even as you try to drift, part of you frets, because back then, sleep wasn't just healthful, it was political. That may sound dramatic, but think of it. The upper classes were expected to sleep easily and deeply, a sign of clean conscience and untroubled wealth. The working class, however, often struggled with disrupted sleep from long shifts and crowded tenement conditions. And the assumption, of course, was that their insomnia stemmed from bad habits or weak discipline. Early to bed, early to rise. Preach the moralists, quoting Franklin as if he'd lived just around the corner in Kensington. But what if your bed was a straw mat beside the furnace, and your job kept you standing in a factory until midnight? You're luckier than most. A room to yourself, a fireplace that mostly works, and a blanket that only smells faintly of mothballs. Still, the restlessness lingers. Victorian nights, after all, are long, and lit only by flickering fire and memory. You hear a carriage rattle past the street below, hooves clapping against stone. A delivery, maybe, or a gentleman returning late from the theater. You imagine him stepping out in his tall hat, clicking the latch on his fine walnut door, and yawning politely before being greeted by a housemaid with a candle. Would he struggle to sleep, too? Or would his brandy-soaked evening and featherbed lull him quickly to dreams? Not all found sleep so elusive. In the upper circles of society, some families had dedicated sleeping chambers, entirely separate from their living quarters, adorned with heavy curtains, fragrant sachets, and feather-stuffed bolsters. Advice books described the ideal sleeping temperature, posture, and even color of bed sheets. Blue calico was considered the most restful. Meanwhile, back in your modest room, you rely on cracked plaster walls and the faintest aroma of damp wood smoke to rock you into a lull. There's a memory, too, of a remedy your great-aunt once swore by placing a smooth stone under your pillow. It had to be river-worn, she said. Something about the mineral hum. She also said sleep could be bribed with sugar cubes left on the windowsill, though that may have just attracted ants. The rain picks up a little. Not a storm, just a firmer rhythm. You picture it, pooling in the street gutters, washing away the day's grime. Somewhere, a cat mews quietly in a doorway, and somewhere else, a tired footman counts out change for a hot meat pie. If you do sleep, it will be soon. But the worry of wakefulness is its own insomnia. You think again about what it meant to be sleepless in these times. How some feared it was a symptom of neurasthenia, a vague, fashionable diagnosis assigned to overworked minds, especially among the wealthy. Men with typewriters and women with watercolors were said to be especially prone. Treatments ranged from mild to alarming. Some doctors recommended vigorous horseback rides or sea voyages. Others, more severe, advocated electric shocks or enforced bed rest under supervision. Sleep wasn't just desired, it was enforced. Historians still wonder if many of these treatments were more about control than care. You lie back now, head on a flattened pillow, gaze tracing the cracked ceiling lines that look oddly like continents. Somewhere in that peeling paint, you imagine a map, a dream world of sleepless travelers. People just like you, reaching back through the years, staring into fireplaces, or chewing an onion slice like it's a bedtime apple. You're not alone. Not in this room. Not in this moment. Thousands drift like you in the soft shadows of this tired century, listening to the rain and waiting for the quiet pull of rest. You stir under the weight of the woolen blanket, scratchy and stubborn, refusing to soften with age. A log hisses in the fireplace as a raindrop sneaks down the chimney, just enough to make it sigh, not enough to put it out. The room smells faintly of damp ash, the kind that lingers in your clothes long after you've left the fire. You're still not asleep, but your thoughts have slowed. Drowsiness circles like a curious cat, waiting for the right moment to curl up beside you. Tonight, you've decided to follow the doctor's orders at least. The ones scribbled into that little leather-bound health journal you found at the second-hand shop. Inside, someone's shaky handwriting recommended a nightly tonic made of boiled hay water and crushed camphor, to be taken with a hymn and a stiff upper lip. You declined the camphor, mostly out of caution, and because it smells like a haunted soap drawer. But the hay water you did attempt, it tasted like sadness and wet curtains. And absolutely nothing happened afterward, except that you burped slightly and felt oddly proud. Victorian remedies were nothing if not creative, with sleep disorders being considered both a spiritual failing and a medical mystery. Treatments took on the character of kitchen experiments mixed with superstition. You might try warm vinegar compresses on the temples one night, and then switch to drinking a pint of tepid barley water the next. One popular approach involved blanket regulation. The idea was that too many layers would overstimulate the body, while too few would chill the soul into restlessness. The correct number, 2.5, not 3, definitely not 1. Historians still argue whether this specificity came from actual studies or the stern opinion of a particularly cold-footed clergyman. And let's not forget the posture prescriptions. Victorians had firm beliefs about how one should position the body during sleep. Lying flat on your back was dignified, but risked apoplexy. On the stomach was considered uncouth and morally slippery. Left side was good for digestion, but only if you hadn't eaten cheese. Ultimately, most agreed the right side was best close to the heart, they said, also symbolic of righteousness. You, however, shift between sides constantly, not for health reasons, just because your hip keeps going numb. The mattress beneath you is more lumpy suggestion than support. Still, it holds you. For now, you think of the pamphlet written in 1857 by Dr. Timothy Hepley, titled The Natural Sleep and the Faults Which Resist It. In it, he claims the key to sleep is tranquil absorption, meaning you should fill your mind with something so gentle and repetitive that it has no choice but to yield a list of past birthdays, a memory of leaves falling in slow spirals, the exact taste of plum jam on Sunday bread. It's not bad advice, really. Certainly better than Dr. Elwyn Fortescue's idea of lacing one's socks with laudanum and letting the skin absorb it slowly. Spoiler, that didn't work. It just made your feet go numb, and your dreams turn unusually Shakespearean. Victorian pharmacology loved these kinds of hacks. A dash of valerian root here, a pinch of belladonna there, just enough to teeter on the edge of poisoning. Many of these substances were sold without regulation, often marketed as soothing syrups or nerve tonics. Entire families dosed themselves nightly without fully understanding what was in those amber bottles. There's a half-empty jar of something similar on your shelf, inherited from a neighbor who moved to Brighton. The label has mostly faded, but you remember her calling it Sleepy Jane. You uncork it, sniff, and immediately regret it. Smells like licorice and metal. You put it back. Outside, the rain continues. You hear the patter rise and fall, like a lullaby with no chorus. The fire pops again, and for a moment, your eyelids droop. Then, a sudden creak in the floor above, probably just the beams settling. But your heart skips anyway. You remember what Dr. Hepley said about interruptions. If one is startled during the descent into sleep, the body reacts as if it were awaking from a fall. You don't know if that's true, but it certainly feels that way. You tug the blanket higher. Victorian society held strange ideas about what triggered insomnia. Too much reading, overexposure to the piano, heated religious debate. There were even reports suggesting sleep could be delayed by writing letters too late at night. Something about the emotional strain of correspondence being electrical in nature. It's worth noting, too, that many Victorians believed in brain rest. If the mind were overstimulated, especially in women, it needed to be cooled. Some women were forbidden from attending lectures or reading novels after dark. Doctors claimed such activity could ignite the nerves and delay sleep for days. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were grounded in any science or simply dressed up misogyny. You're grateful your own reading hasn't been banned. The magazine on your lap might not be thrilling, but its dull pages and dusty grammar lull your eyes slowly. You scan an article about rail schedules. There's a sentence describing the pleasing predictability of engine whistles, and you suddenly feel a wave of peace. There's a pattern in these Victorian sleep cures: predictability, repetition, quiet rituals that may or may not have had any medical merit, but gave people something to do with their sleeplessness. You begin to understand the appeal. When you can't sleep, a ritual, even a strange one, is better than the blank stare of the ceiling. You decide to try one of your own. You fold the corner of your page, lean forward to stoke the fire, and then slowly count backwards from 50. Not sheep, just numbers. Soft, slow, letting each one melt into the next. 50, 49, 48. You pause briefly at 39. That number always feels oddly round, like it should be something more. You blink. Outside, the rain shifts direction, tapping against the opposite window pane now, as if to keep you company from a new angle. 38, 37. You rest your head back on the chair. Not quite lying down yet, but not quite upright either. Somewhere in between, like your mind. 36, 35, 34. Your voice, even inside your head, begins to slur gently around the numbers. You don't mind. That, too, is part of the ritual. In the flickering light of the fire, everything seems slightly slower now. Time elongates like molasses in a chilled spoon. By 33, your thoughts are wandering, not just drifting, and curiously, they wander back to onions. You recall the advice you dismissed earlier, the raw onion cure. It was more than an old wives' tale. In Victorian times, this pungent little bulb had a surprisingly loyal following in the world of sleep remedies. Raw onions, sliced thick and chewed before bed, were believed to promote sleep by cooling the blood. You picture yourself biting into one now, like an apple, tears involuntarily springing to your eyes. It's hard to imagine how anything that physically painful could possibly help sleep, but the Victorians swore by it. Some went further. There are reports of people rubbing onion juice on their temples, laying onion slices on their chest, or most baffling of all, sleeping with an onion on their nightstand, as if it would waft peace into their dreams. Historians still argue whether this was purely symbolic or genuinely believed to release soothing vapors. What we do know, onions contain sulfur compounds that relax blood vessels and might, in theory, have a mild calming effect. Or maybe it was simply the distraction from whatever existential crisis you were facing. After all, it's hard to overthink your taxes when your mouth is on fire. You smile at the thought. Somewhere out there, perhaps on this same rainy night in 1872, someone else is snacking on an onion slice and whispering, "Any minute now." That's the thing about Victorian sleep culture. It walks the line between the ludicrous and the oddly touching. People wanted sleep, not just because they were tired, but because sleep represented peace, virtue, and relief from a world that, despite all its lace and manners, was deeply exhausting. You reach toward the small tin box beside the hearth. It contains what's left of your evening odds and ends. A stub of lavender soap, 2 buttons you keep meaning to sew back onto your coat, and a folded recipe for Mrs. Langley's sleep pudding. Supposedly, it's just cream, nutmeg, and a dash of gin. You unfold it again, rereading the instructions. There's a gentle absurdity in the care someone took to transcribe such a thing, likely in ink that's now faded to soft sepia. The Victorian world was full of these tiny rituals, handwritten cures passed between neighbors, scrawled recipes shared among friends in the hopes of easing one another into slumber. Some cures took on almost mythic qualities. There was the belief that placing a piece of iron under the bed would ground restless energy. Others insisted on wool socks soaked in vinegar. The more elaborate remedies were saved for the well-to-do sleeping capsules, powdered morphine in dainty tins, or long sessions with a nerve doctor who charged a guinea per hour just to listen. You never met a nerve doctor, but you did once overhear one at the market. lecturing a grocer about the dangers of nocturnal unrest. His solution: a spoonful of mustard seeds and a good conscience still seated beside the fire. You glance down at your hands. They're lightly freckled with soot and warm. You stretch your fingers. The fire has grown low again, but it doesn't matter. The warmth has sunk into your bones. You imagine what it must have felt like in a grander home, some Georgian manor with thick velvet drapes and a coal scuttle always full. Wealth bought sleep differently, not always better, but more cushioned. And yet, despite the wealth gap, the worry was the same. Everyone wanted sleep, and no one could quite figure out how to get it. In some households, it was fashionable to keep a sleep diary, a little notebook on the nightstand where one would record dreams, moods, and how many hours of rest they'd managed. You can picture them now. Entries full of poetic frustration. March 18th. Slept little. Dreamed of geese and snow. Mild terror. Unsure why. Or the recurring lament. April 7th. Fire too hot. Sheets too crisp. Moon far too bold. These diaries have become minor treasures in archives. Windows into the personal rhythms of long-dead lives. Historians treasure them for what they reveal, not just about sleep, but about fear, hope, intimacy, and the endless negotiation between body and clock. You wonder what your own sleep diary might say tonight, May 28th. Rain soft. Onion untouched. Thoughts looping, but voice in the rain oddly comforting. You smile again. A small one. The kind that doesn't disturb the rest of your face. In many ways, this very moment, this quiet time with the fire crackling, your body still, the onion waiting patiently nearby, is exactly what those Victorian doctors wanted for their patients. A slowing down, a preparation. They called it sleep hygiene long before it became a wellness buzzword. Not just what you do at bedtime, but how you live your evenings. No harsh words. No sudden excitement. Just soft routines, tea, warm lighting, a slow read of the paper, and maybe, if you were lucky, a cat curled on the windowsill. You listen now, half expecting to hear that mythical cat pawing at the panes. Instead, the rain continues, rhythmic and kind. You close your eyes, not to sleep yet, but to practice. You've read that blinking slowly can help the body ease into drowsiness. You try it. Open, close, pause, open, close. The onion is still on the table, a silent guardian of the night. Maybe you'll try it tomorrow. Maybe you won't need to. A soft knock sounds somewhere in the building. Not your door. Maybe the neighbors. Or perhaps it's nothing at all. Sometimes, old wood settles with a sound like knuckles. You blink again, slower this time, then let your eyes linger shut for a moment longer than usual. Before we continue, a gentle check-in just for you. Hey everyone, we've reached this point. Have you drifted off to sleep yet? If you're still awake, drop a comment to let me know where you're at and how you're feeling. But if you're already fast asleep, I wish you a deep, restful sleep filled with beautiful dreams. Now, let's float gently back into the story. The rain still humming in the background, wrapping the world in its watery hush. Your fingers trace the edge of the onion's papery skin. It rustles under your touch, light and dry, like the pages of an old book. You leave it on the table and return to your chair by the fire. The logs have quieted into embers, glowing like sleepy eyes. You stare into them, and your thoughts meander to other fireplaces, grand ones, carved in marble, where insomnia sat quietly in silk robes. In the more refined corners of Victorian society, people often treated sleep disturbances with luxury. If you couldn't fall asleep, perhaps you needed a new chaise lounge, or a Turkish rug, or a gentler servant to prepare your bed. But for most, the answer to sleeplessness was simpler. Stare into the fire. This advice came from across classes. Doctors, clergy, and grandmothers all agreed. There was something deeply calming about watching flames flicker and curl. It was a hypnotic rhythm, slow and looping, a bit like raindrops, or storytelling, or the way your thoughts slow when you're not quite awake, but not fully dreaming. Historians still argue whether this fire therapy was ever formally studied, or whether it was just one of those things everyone knew worked, like butter on burns or tea for heartache. You lean closer, eyes half lidded, and imagine you're in one of the grander drawing rooms of London, a place where velvet curtains mute the world, and a servant brings warm milk on a silver tray. You're reading Dickens aloud. Of course, because it's always Dickens, and the lady of the house is pretending not to nod off mid-chapter. Even then, sleep was a thing chased delicately. It didn't matter if you wore a monocle or a patched nightshirt. The same restlessness visited all. Some tried to outwit it with games. There were sleep books, gentle tales, often with intentionally dull plot lines and circular storytelling, designed to lull. You might have heard of the Young Lady's Forget-Me-Not sleep reader, which included such classics as The Clock That Never Struck and Mild Adventures in the Garden. No cliffhangers, no surprise endings, just predictability in sentence form. You feel a pang of envy. You wouldn't mind reading Mild Adventures in the Garden right now. Just the idea of it sounds still. Instead, you do what many did. You settle deeper into your chair and let your eyes follow the flame's movements. Up and down, flicker and fold. Each shift of light on the walls reminds you of memories you haven't touched in years, like the bedtime routine at your grandmother's cottage, where she used to boil potatoes late into the night just to keep the place warm. You'd sit by the stove, watching her hands move through shadow and steam, waiting for sleep to sneak up behind you. Back in Victorian times, keeping a room warm wasn't always an option. Coal was costly, and fireplaces were finicky. Many households had only one heated room. If that, whole families might sleep huddled together, more for warmth than affection. You picture it now, a row of sleeping children, curled like commas under one thick blanket, the parents not far off, mumbling sleepy prayers, hoping the baby wouldn't cry and the wind wouldn't sneak through the gaps in the glass. And still, sleep didn't always come. They tried everything. Some burned rosemary or lavender, believing the scent could soothe nerves. Others placed a small Bible under the mattress, not for reading, but to settle the weight of one's soul. You lean your head back, not quite asleep, but not worried about it anymore either. The rain outside softens again, whispering instead of tapping now. Like it. You're quieter too. You think briefly of the ghost stories told to children to keep them in bed. Tales of the wakeful man, a pale figure who wandered alleys, looking for those who refused to sleep. Supposedly, he'd tap at your window and whisper nonsense until you gave in from exhaustion. Scary, maybe. But to some, the idea of someone else wanting them to sleep was comforting. That's really all any of this was. Wasn't it? A way to feel safe enough to drift? The room creaks once more, a lullaby in timber. You open your eyes briefly, glance at the window. Raindrops slide down the pane like beads on a string. Everything is slow now. Everything is soft. The onion still waits on the table, untouched. Maybe tonight. You won't need it after all. The fire has mostly gone to embers now. Just the faintest orange glow remains, tucked like a secret into the hearth's curve. You don't bother adding more wood. It would be too loud, too jarring. Instead, you let the room darken around you, letting the soft rhythm of rain and the occasional creak of the floorboards carry your thoughts gently forward. You shift your position, just a little. The chair groans softly under your weight. An old companion reminding you it's still there. You're not quite ready for bed, but you're also not truly awake anymore. You exist in that quiet, liminal space, a kind of in-between, and now your thoughts drift further, beyond your small rented room, beyond the city, beyond the soot and the softly hissing kettle that always seems just about to boil. You think of far-off places where Victorian insomnia also took root. Because insomnia wasn't a purely British affair, it followed the steamships, the telegraphs, and the map lines drawn in red. The empire never slept. In the colonies India, Hong Kong, South Africa, Jamaica, English settlers carried their sleeplessness with them, packed neatly between their woolen vests and moral superiority. They brought not only insomnia, but Victorian ideas about sleep, when to do it, how long it should last, what a respectable sleeper looked like. In hot climates, sleep itself became a daily puzzle. The weather was often too warm, too damp, too noisy. Locals, of course, had long adapted. Afternoon siestas, light bedding, breezy architecture. But the English clung stubbornly to their heavy covers and fixed bedtime hours, even if they sweated through the night in stiff cotton sheets. You imagine a colonial officer lying flat on a four-poster bed in Bombay, a mosquito net hanging limp like a ghost shawl. He shifts and sighs, the ceiling fan turning lazily above. The air is thick. He has a glass of quinine water beside him, barely touched, and still he cannot sleep. Why? Because sleep, for him, must follow ritual. His valet must prepare his slippers. The sheets must be tucked just so. The brandy measured exactly. The journal entry penned with care. Without these, sleep feels improper. And improper sleep, he's been told, is a gateway to madness. Victorians believed this. The line between restlessness and ruin was thin, especially when far from home. Historians still argue whether the colonial insomnia described in letters and journals reflected physical discomfort or a deeper sense of unease, a creeping recognition that perhaps not everything about empire building sat well with the soul, and maybe, just maybe, the sleepless nights were guilt, politely dressed as climate complaints. Meanwhile, the local populations accustomed to the rhythm of the tropics watched the English stew in their bedchambers. Servants brought warm milk. Cook boys prepared toast at 200 a.m. Entire household staffs adjusted to the master's sleepless nights. In one household in Calcutta, it was noted that a maid was hired solely to whisper calming verses near the doorway in the early hours. Not sing whisper, just enough to soothe, not to entertain, like a living lullaby. On call for 3 shillings a month. You wonder what it would feel like to have someone gently whispering poetry just beyond the edge of sleep, closer to home. Insomnia traveled too to the Scottish Highlands, to Irish villages, to Welsh mining towns, in rural areas where gaslight was rare and the night was truly dark. Sleeplessness took a different form there. The problem was often too much silence. When the wind died down and the sheep were still, every heartbeat felt like a drum. And so people made up stories. They told tales of the night wanderers, spirits that crept through the hills and settled into your chest when you lay too still, to ward them off. Some families placed a broom upside down by the door, or turned their shoes backward before sleep. Others whispered protective prayers over a cup of water placed beside the bed. These rituals were not called cures, but they were practiced faithfully. Victorians in every corner of the empire had one thing in common: they feared wakefulness. Not just because it was unpleasant, but because they believed it left them vulnerable to spirits, to madness, to judgment. One medical journal from 1879 described a woman who hadn't slept properly in 12 years. Her diagnosis: excessive thoughtfulness, the cure prescribed. A sea voyage, limited correspondence, and boiled turnips. There is no record of whether the turnips helped. Back in your room, you chuckle softly at the thought. You haven't eaten a turnip in months, but you understand the craving for anything that might bring sleep. You think again of all those sleepless people in far-off lands, lying in strange beds, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds. And yet, despite distance and difference, You are all doing the same thing, staring into the dark and hoping for rest. It's oddly comforting. The rain continues, gentle and sure. You picture it falling on that officer's mosquito net, on the Scottish heather, on the broad banana leaves outside a Jamaican veranda. All of you together in the same downpour, held by the same night. You lean back just a little more. The chair creaks again. A soft groan of age. The onion still on the table. Of course, it hasn't moved. You probably won't need it tonight, but you're oddly comforted knowing it's there. A Victorian companion. Pungent, patient, and ready. The room has grown cooler, but not cold. Just enough for the wool blanket to earn its keep. You pull it a little tighter around your shoulders, shifting until the fringe brushes your chin. The fire is no longer a flame, but a gentle pulse, coals glowing faintly, like embers of memory. Your eyes settle, heavy now, on the darkened edge of the room. The rain outside has become a near whisper, more rhythm than sound. It's the sort of night that makes you forget where one thought ends and another begins. And now, your mind turns to the women of the Victorian age. Because for them, sleep or the lack of it was a matter laced not only with health, but with etiquette. Being a sleepless Victorian woman came with its own peculiar burdens. For starters, society didn't quite know what to do with the idea. Women were supposed to be calm, composed, delicate. Insomnia suggested agitation, and agitation was a masculine trait unless, of course, it could be categorized as a nervous condition. Enter female hysteria. This catch-all diagnosis absorbed everything from mild irritability to chronic fatigue to, you guessed it, difficulty sleeping. Historians still debate the actual medical basis of hysteria, though most now agree it was less of a real condition and more of a polite box into which society could stuff all the inconvenient female experiences it didn't want to understand. So when a Victorian woman couldn't sleep, she was often labeled delicate. She might be told to lie in a darkened room for several days. She might be given a light sedative made from poppies and chamomile, or simply encouraged to read fewer novels. You imagine her now, our fictional lady of the night. Not the scandalous kind, just a woman, wide awake at midnight, perched on the edge of her embroidered bed. The candle beside her is guttering, its wax catching on a bit of lace. She has followed every rule, eaten her light supper, walked exactly 14 times around the garden, worn only her thinnest nightgown, and still, sleep eludes her. To mention it out loud would be indelicate. So she remains silent. It wasn't proper to speak of insomnia at afternoon teas or sewing circles. Women were expected to be tireless caregivers, and discussing their own exhaustion might imply they were not up to the task. So instead, they hinted, a passing mention of headaches, a polite request for fewer late dinners, a subtle yawn behind a gloved hand. Some journals from the time contain entries like, slept poorly again, shall try peppermint this evening, or perhaps 2 hymns instead of 1. Others reveal something more heartbreaking. Awake again at 3. The silence seems louder each night. I do not know what I've done wrong. You think of her again, this woman you've invented, but who surely existed. Her hair tied back neatly, even at night. A book of Psalms on her lap, unread. She sits very still, trying to will herself to sleep with sheer obedience, because to her, insomnia feels like failure. Of course, there were women who rebelled in small ways. A few embraced their midnight wakefulness. They wrote poetry by candlelight. They painted. They paced the hallways of silent houses like ghosts with something important to say. Some women, usually those with a bit of wealth or eccentricity, turned their sleeplessness into a kind of quiet independence. There are tales of restless widows who spent their nights cataloging birds, collecting recipes, or translating French novels. They did not sleep, but they did live. Still, the standard response was to hide it. Doctors, always eager to explain, the female condition prescribed warm milk, quiet prayer, and in some cases, supervised bed rest. Imagine being told that your only hope for sleep was to remain in bed 24 hours a day, under the watch of a nurse who fluffed your pillows and limited your exposure to distressing thoughts. And what counted as distressing newspapers, novels, music in a minor key, women's ambitions. You sigh softly at that, because while it all sounds distant and strange, some of it isn't that far off, is it? Even now, some people are told that if they can't sleep, they must be doing something wrong. Eating too late, scrolling too much, wanting too much. You glance at the onion again. It hasn't moved, of course, but it's starting to feel like a roommate, a reminder that no matter how absurd the cure, there was always someone trying to help, even if that help came wrapped in social expectations, embroidery, and moral judgment. Victorian women carried the weight of sleeplessness quietly. It was another invisible chore, tucked in between mending socks and managing guest lists. If they did speak about it, they framed it in acceptable terms: concern for others, grief, nervousness over the children. Never simply, I am tired and I cannot sleep. Historians still argue how many women quietly resisted, how many scribbled truths in their margins, snuck chocolate at midnight, or whispered secrets to the rain. You like to think it was many. You lean your head to the side, letting your cheek rest against the back of the chair. A soft exhale escapes you. Not quite a sigh, not quite sleep, and somewhere in the echo of this rain-soaked evening, you think you hear her, that long-ago woman, turning a page slowly, eyes scanning words she's read 100 times, not for meaning, but for rhythm. Sleep might not come easily, but it isn't shameful to want it, and it isn't failure to chase it. You shift a little, stretching your toes beneath the blanket, now warmed by your own stillness. There's a rhythm to the night now, a slow tempo, soft and steady, like a lullaby hummed under breath. The rain has not stopped. It rarely does in this dream version of Victorian London. It's part of the architecture, like cobblestones and candlelight. You're not asleep, but you're no longer fully in this room either. Your mind wanders again, as it so often does at this hour, and this time it drifts into a darker, hazier corner of the Victorian sleep world, the opium corner. Because while warm milk and fireplace gazing were all well and good, sometimes the tonic needed bite. Opium was the Victorian age's not-so-secret sleep solution. It was everywhere, in teas, tinctures, lozenges, and little brown bottles with names like Mother Bailey's Soothing Syrup or Mr. Ashby's Night Drops. You could walk into almost any apothecary and, without so much as a blush, purchase enough laudanum to knock out a horse, or at least a well-read insomniac. You picture it, a slim glass vial on the corner of a nightstand, amber liquid catching the glow of the firelight, the label curling at the edge, the cork stained dark. 1 teaspoon for rest, 2 for dreams. More than that, and the night might get a little too permanent. It's hard to imagine today, but back then, opium wasn't scandalous. It was domestic. It was respectable. It was recommended in the pages of the Family Physician's Handbook, nestled between tips on seasonal fruit and gout management. You imagine a middle-class housewife, sleep-deprived from 6 children, a testy husband, and a wash tub that squeaks like a haunted violin. She stirs a few drops into her evening tea, closes her eyes, and for a little while, the world softens. Historians still debate just how many Victorians were functionally addicted to opium. Addiction wasn't well understood, then not in the way we talk about it now. If anything, regular use was seen as a sign of being well managed, well prepared. If you couldn't sleep, it meant you weren't in control. If you could sleep, even with help, you were still doing your duty. And so, opium floated quietly through bedrooms and parlors, through doctors' bags and purse clasps. It was whispered about, but not condemned. Not yet. There were, of course, risks, stories of overdoses, of hallucinations mistaken for divine visions, of infants given Godfrey's cordial and never waking again. But those were unfortunate outliers, explained away in the same breath that praised the tonic's effectiveness. You glance again at your little tin box. No opium there. Just a few dusty mints and a dried-out sachet of lavender. Probably safer that way. Still, you feel a strange connection to those long-ago sleepers, the ones who turned to something stronger when the night became too heavy. Their fears were your fears, though cloaked in petticoats and the scent of cloves. And yet, even with opium, the rituals remained. You didn't just knock back a dose and flop into bed. No. You had to prepare the room, fluff the pillows, light the right lamp, say the correct prayer. Sometimes you even had to record your intentions for the night in a little notebook, what you hoped to dream, what thoughts you'd let go. because even drug-assisted sleep was supposed to be orderly. A moral, gentle drifting, not a collapse. That's what separates the Victorian idea of sleep from modern ones. It wasn't just about rest. It was about how you rested. To fall asleep sloppily, with your boots still on and your emotions in disarray, was almost as bad as not sleeping at all. You think of the old etiquette books, with their impossible lists of bedtime behaviors. Brush the hair exactly 100 strokes. Cleanse the face with cold rose water. Kiss the smallest child good night last to preserve their innocence. Whisper a brief apology to the Lord for any daytime failings. Then, and only then, lie down on the right side, naturally, and await divine rest. You'd fail that list by item 2, maybe item 1, but perhaps that's why you're here awake, or nearly so, in a room with no rose water, no lordly apologies, and an onion growing a little too comfortable in its spot on your side table. Still, there's something deeply human about the effort. Whether it was opium or ritual, or a prayer muttered between yawns, people wanted sleep because it made them feel more like themselves. It returned them to their quietest form. No masks, no schedules, no responsibilities. Victorian poets wrote about sleep like it was a lover, waiting with open arms just beyond the door. Gentle, mysterious, temperamental. One wrote, "I offered her warm milk and trembling hands, but she passed me by, silent as a bell under snow." Another claimed, "Sleep is not earned, but forgiven." You think about that a while. Maybe sleep is a kind of forgiveness, a release from the day's small failures, the missed buttons, the overcooked dinner, the thing you forgot to say. And maybe that's why the Victorians chased it so desperately. Not just to rest, but to be restored. You tilt your head toward the fire, which has now settled into a long, patient glow. The rain is soft again, the kind of soft that makes even the street rats tiptoe. And you, dear listener, are very nearly asleep. You've wandered through onion dreams and opium bottles, across drawing rooms and colonial bedrooms, and still you linger at the edge of sleep. Not because you don't belong there, but because, like the Victorians, you're just trying to get it right. But here's a secret: there's no right way, no perfect ritual. Sometimes, sleep comes when you stop performing for it. So stop. Just be here. Let the rain murmur. Let the chair creak. Let the onion do absolutely nothing. You're doing just fine. The fire is no more than a memory. A faint warmth radiating from brick and ash. It leaves behind a smoky scent, just barely noticeable, like the last note of a lullaby lingering after the music has stopped. Your blanket, once scratchy and stiff, now feels like it's grown heavier, not with weight, but with calm. A hush has settled in the room. Outside, the rain slows to a delicate tickle against the window glass, as though it, too, is winding down. And in that hush, another thought takes shape. Clocks. You listen for yours, half hoping it's gone silent. But no, there it is. Tick, tick, tick. The Victorians had a thing about time. They loved to measure it, control it, obsess over it. Time was not just a backdrop to daily life, it was the choreographer. It told you when to wake, when to pray, when to boil your eggs, when to mourn your uncle. And yes, most definitely, when to sleep. It's no coincidence that some of the loudest things in a Victorian household were the clocks. Grandfather clocks, mantle clocks, pocket watches with tiny, precise hands. Even the factory floor had its own gongs and bells. Time was everywhere, ticking and chiming and reminding you constantly that your minutes were being watched. But here's the cruel part. The more time they kept, the harder it was to let it go. Imagine trying to sleep with the booming tick of a hallway clock announcing every second of your failure to drift off. Tick. You're still awake. Tick. You have to be up in 4 hours. Tick. Your soul may be unraveling. The Victorians even had a phrase for this feeling time dread. It wasn't the fear of time itself, but the fear of knowing exactly how long you'd been lying awake. They believed this kind of awareness caused spiritual and physical harm. It wore on the nerves, frayed the heart. Some claimed it led to madness, or at least very poor posture. To combat it, some people hid their clocks at night. Others placed handkerchiefs over the face so the numbers couldn't accuse them. A few turned the hands back just to feel like they'd stolen a moment of peace. Historians still debate whether this obsession with time was a result of industrialization or a symptom of something older. The human fear of being left behind by progress, by fashion, by fate. If you couldn't fall asleep at the right time, maybe you weren't keeping up. You lean your head against the back of the chair, eyes half-lidded. Your own clock, though less dramatic, continues to tick. You've stopped checking it. That feels like a small rebellion, a quiet victory. You remember an essay by a Victorian preacher, his name lost to memory, who claimed that sleep was a holy act, not because of what it did for the body, but because it allowed the soul to fall into God's rhythm. According to him, lying awake at night was akin to stepping out of step with the divine clockwork of the universe. That's a heavy weight to put on a Tuesday night's rest. And yet, there's something beautiful in the idea of sleep as alignment. That when you finally let go, you're syncing up with something bigger than yourself, a universal lullaby. In response, the Victorians created countless tools to bring themselves back into alignment. There were bed-warming pans to coax the body into comfort, weighted quilts filled with rice or sand, sleep bonnets tied under the chin like a gentle hug. Every detail mattered. Every stitch was a promise, but clocks kept ticking. Even the smallest ones, watches tucked under pillows or tied to dressing gowns, marked the minutes like judges with tiny gavels. You think now of the factory workers whose lives were ruled by whistles. The shift bell rang, and you rose. Another rang, and you returned home. Yet another told you it was time to put out the candle and lie down. Whether or not sleep had deigned to visit, many workers kept time with the faint glow of street lamps. When the last one flickered out, it meant dawn was coming. Their sleep short, broken, dreamless, was the rhythm of survival. No opium drops, no sleep bonnets, just exhaustion. And then there were the servants' maids, porters, scullery boys who had no set bedtime at all. They slept in fits, in corners, in silence. They weren't allowed to be tired. Sleep, for them, was not a right. It was a negotiation. You try to imagine it dozing on a wooden bench, apron still tied, boots still on, hearing the grandfather clock tick through each missed moment of real rest. A poet of the time wrote, "I watched the clock, and it watched me. We nodded, slow, in grim accord, and through the night, eternally, it struck. While I could not afford, the ticking of time, back then, was less a background hum and more a chorus of expectation. You were supposed to be doing something with every minute. If you were resting, it had better be the correct kind of rest. You close your eyes again, trying to imagine a world without clocks, just the sound of the rain, the occasional crack of coal settling, a rhythm not kept by gears and hands, but by breath. Inhale, pause, exhale. The only clock that matters now is your own heartbeat, and even that seems slower now. More content. Outside, the clouds shift slightly. A breeze whispers past the chimney. The city sleeps unevenly, some in luxury, some in squalor, but all under the same veil of rain and shadow. And you are almost there. Tick, or maybe not. The ticking fades now, not because the clock has stopped, but because you've stopped hearing it. It's still there, sure, persistent as ever. But your mind has moved beyond it, like a train slipping quietly out of the station, leaving the platform far behind. The rain has grown gentler again, barely brushing the windows. The night air is still. Even the floorboards seem to have decided enough creaking for one evening. Everything is quieter. Everything. Except your thoughts. But before we wander too far, a quick little check-in. Hey everyone. We've reached this point. Have you drifted off to sleep yet? If you're still awake, drop a comment to let me know where you're at and how you're feeling. But if you're already fast asleep, I hope your dreams are gentle, curious, and full of warm firelight. Now, back to the story, soft as a sigh, smooth as candle wax. You think now of the people whose sleep was never truly theirs to begin with. The ones who didn't have fireplaces or onions or sleepy poems to rely on. The ones whose insomnia wasn't a mystery or a medical concern, but just a fact of life. The working class, sleep for the Victorian poor, was not measured in quality. It was measured in opportunity. If you had time to sleep, that was a luxury. If you had a mattress, that was a miracle. And yet, despite this, they still had rituals, still had beliefs, still had ways of finding peace between shifts at the textile mill or half days on the docks. You imagine a young woman folding laundry in a basement flat, her hands raw from soap. She stretches out on a straw-stuffed mattress, the kind that crinkles when she breathes, and listens to the rats tap dancing in the walls. She can't afford to toss and turn. Her alarm is a shout from the foreman, not a clock. So she sleeps hard, if she can sleep at all. In crowded tenements, entire families would sleep in a single room, sometimes even in shifts. Fathers taking the night half after working late. Children curling into gaps when the heat of others left a spot. There wasn't space for insomnia. It wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was just a thing that happened, and you worked through it. They didn't get laudanum. They got barley broth, maybe a biscuit, if one was left over. Historians still argue whether the poor really slept worse than the middle and upper classes, or whether their sleep was simply different, more urgent, less decorated, less worried over, maybe even, in a strange way, purer. Because when sleep came, it came because the body had to shut down, not because a doctor said it was healthy. Of course, there were costs. A lack of rest meant slower reactions at work. Slower reactions meant injuries. And in a time before workers' rights, injuries often meant unemployment. And unemployment meant, well, worse. You think now of one coal miner's journal from 1874. Just a few pages, brittle and ink-faded. On one page, he writes, "Too tired to eat, laid down by the stove, dreamed of cold porridge, still tired, that's it, not a complaint, just a record." The kind of weary honesty that makes you ache a little. And yet, even in those circumstances, there was tenderness. Families would take turns heating bricks to place in each other's beds. Neighbors would share cups of watered-down milk as a sleep tonic. Some even sang lullabies through the walls, not for children, but for each other. You imagine lying there, wrapped in worn wool, a faint hum of a song seeping through the plaster, a sound that says, "I'm still here too." Not all sleep cures were about potions or prayer. Sometimes it was just the presence of another person, the rise and fall of a sibling's breath, the shared silence of a spouse. Even strangers in boarding houses found comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their restlessness. That's something the upper classes often lacked. Loneliness, after all, can be loud at midnight. You turn your head slightly, listening to your own quiet room. The rain, the creaks, the soft puff of breath against the blanket. It's peaceful, but also solitary. Maybe that's why those crowded sleeping spaces, for all their discomfort, held a kind of magic. You didn't have to explain why you couldn't sleep. Someone beside you couldn't either. So you just were together. There's a kind of closeness in shared insomnia, a midnight kinship, the kind of bond that doesn't require talking or fixing or even looking at each other. Just the mutual understanding that the night is long and you are both in it. You think now of how the poor mark time without clocks. Some use church bells. Others listened for the baker's carts in the morning. Some counted the number of horses that passed outside a rhythm as good as any. You try to count now, not horses, but heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, the same way they did. Not to measure anything, just to feel time passing, softly. And maybe somewhere, someone else is doing the same. Your breath feels heavier now, though not in a burdensome way. More like fog drifting across a sleepy moor slow. Soft, unbothered. The rain outside has faded into near silence, like a record that's run to the end and forgotten to stop. Every sound in the room, however small, seems part of the hush now, the pop of cooling embers, the distant patter of a mouse, the rustle of the blanket as you shift once more, just to find that perfect spot. And yet, sleep remains coy, hovering, waiting. You open your eyes briefly, just enough to let them settle on the ceiling. Faint shadows dance their wavering silhouettes from the last of the firelight. One of them almost looks like a rabbit, or maybe a teapot. You blink again. It disappears. It's in this hovering space, this neither here nor there of almost sleep, that your thoughts veer into one of the more peculiar corners of the Victorian mind, a place where sleep, morality, and brace yourself, certain private habits were all suspiciously entangled, because, yes, tonight we're gently tiptoeing into one of the strangest beliefs of the 19th century, the curious idea that sleeplessness could be caused by personal misbehavior, specifically self-induced nocturnal temptation. You know the one. Victorians didn't say the word out loud very often, but when they did, it was with hushed voices and a lot of deeply furrowed brows. They called it self-abuse, solitary vice, or, most dramatically, the great moral failing. And they absolutely believed it ruined your sleep. Not just your character, your literal, physical ability to fall asleep. You imagine a young man in a boarding house room, staring wide-eyed at the ceiling, blanket clutched up to his chin like it's holy armor. Somewhere, in a drawer or under his mattress, is a pamphlet he regrets reading, perhaps titled "The Sin of Stimulation and Its Effects on Sleep." The subtitle probably says something like, "A Guide for Pious Youths," printed on cheap paper, sold for a penny at street corners and church bazaars. Inside, he'd find charts, diagrams, cautions from physicians, warnings that any impure behavior would lead to insomnia, trembling hands, spiritual erosion, and, of course, eventual blindness. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were genuinely medical or simply a very enthusiastic blend of morality and pseudoscience. Probably both. Books like Onanism, a treatise on the disorders produced by masturbation, were widely circulated, mostly by people who were very concerned about the moral health of others. Some doctors went so far as to claim that touching oneself disrupted the body's internal sleep energy like blowing out the wick of your own rest, and so insomnia became not just a nuisance, but a moral accusation. Parents were instructed to monitor their children's bedtime routines closely. Keep the bedclothes light. Don't let them nap during the day. Avoid sugar, excitement, and oddly pickled foods, which were believed to arouse unnatural desires. Yes, really, Victorians had a lot of feelings about pickles. You picture a poor teenage boy, wide awake, haunted by guilt over the gherkin he snuck from the pantry, wondering if that sour crunch has sealed his sleepless fate. Even adults weren't spared. Grown men confessed to their doctors that they'd fallen into bad habits and now found themselves unable to rest. Some women, especially those who lived alone, were diagnosed with uterine insomnia, a totally made-up condition used to explain their supposed nervous behaviors and other activities. The solutions hilariously grim: leather sleeping mittens, cold sponge baths, beds designed to creak loudly at the slightest movement. There were even contraptions, mercifully rare, that delivered mild electric shocks if a person shifted suspiciously under the sheets. None of this helped anyone sleep. Not really. But it did increase anxiety. And anxiety, as we all know, is insomnia's favorite dance partner. There were some who pushed back. A few enlightened doctors suggested that perhaps sleeplessness wasn't always a moral failing. Maybe it had more to do with stress, diet, or the sheer noise of living in an industrial world where everything beeped, clanged, whistled, or whirred. But those voices were quieter, and they rarely made it into the pamphlets. Guilt was just louder. Even in the dead of night, you think now of how lucky you are not to carry that particular burden tonight. No charts warning you about the terrible consequences of humming to yourself in bed. No terrifying diagrams lurking under your pillow. Just you, the rain, the onion still stoically useless, and a growing awareness that sleep might come sooner than you thought. You glance at the fireplace. A single ember winks at you from the ash. Like it, too, has one last secret to share before turning in. You wonder how many people lay awake under the same kind of pressure, told they were sick because of something they couldn't even name, told their dreams were impure, that their restlessness was punishment. It makes your own insomnia feel strangely lighter, less shameful, more human, because here you are, still awake perhaps, but not afraid, not guilty, just listening to the night breathe. You shift slightly, and your blanket rustles again. The sound like wind through dry grass. The room holds its quiet. The clock ticks somewhere, but you've forgotten where. And if you listen very, very carefully, you might hear the softest of sounds, the great moral panic of 1870s England, giving one last sigh before turning over and going to sleep. You stir gently under the blanket, more from a dreamy stretch than any real discomfort. The fire has faded to a memory, the rain now barely a suggestion against the glass. The room, once filled with flickering shadows and soft domestic clinks, feels suspended. Time here is syrup slow, a place where even thought lingers a moment longer before moving on. Your eyes trace the faint outline of the door across the room. It's closed, of course, but you can imagine what lies beyond its stairs, likely creaky, leading to another floor filled with other rooms, other beds, and perhaps other insomniacs, some resting, some pacing, some caught mid-blink between two dreams that haven't quite begun. And now, your mind begins to drift once more, this time toward the places where sleep wasn't just a challenge, it was regulated, measured, sometimes even punished. Welcome to the sleeping arrangements of the Victorian institutional world. Orphanages, prisons, asylums, workhouses, the homes for the unwanted, the unlucky, and the unwell. In these places, sleep wasn't a private act. It wasn't a retreat. It was scheduled, monitored, often rationed like bread or soap. You didn't just lie down when you felt like it. You slept when you were told, and only then. You imagine yourself now in one of those places. A thin straw mattress in a long, echoing hall. Dozens of beds lined in strict rows, like soldiers at ease. The smell of cold porridge still lingering from supper. The sound of a cough down the row. Then another. One blanket, one pillow, one night. Exactly 6 hours long. In institutions, sleep wasn't for comfort. It was for discipline, a way to reinforce order. Sleep too much. You were lazy. Sleep too little. You were unstable. Get up at the wrong time, punishment. Historians still argue whether the harsh sleeping environments in these facilities were intended to toughen the spirit or simply to make people too tired to rebel. Take the workhouse. For instance, these sprawling complexes, designed to provide shelter and labor for the poor, operated on strict, inflexible routines. Wake-up bells rang at 5 a.m., followed by inspections, breakfast, then hours of hard labor. Lights out came early, but sleep was rarely easy. Beds, if they could be called that, were often just boards with sacks of straw. Some facilities experimented with communal hammocks, under the theory that gentle swinging might calm nervous inmates. Instead, it usually made everyone seasick. In asylums, things were stranger still. Victorian psychiatrists believed that poor sleep contributed to mental illness, but also that mental illness caused poor sleep. A wonderful circular logic. So, treatments varied widely, from gentle to deeply unsettling. Patients were sometimes given special sleep baths, long, tepid soaks in deep tubs where they'd float for hours, not to cleanse the body, but to slow the mind. Staff believed that if the skin softened, the thoughts would too. Whether that worked is, at best, unclear. More extreme approaches included enforced rest therapies, padded rooms with no light, no stimulation, and sometimes no clothing. You lay on a narrow cot under observation until you fell asleep or broke down, trying. One physician described it as rest by denial. You deny the patient everything except stillness and silence, and eventually the body, starved for movement, collapses into rest. You exhale, long and slow. These were not comforting places, not cozy rooms with creaking chairs and warm fires, but they were part of the same culture that prized sleep as virtue, even when administered as punishment. Sleep was still seen as necessary, healing, restorative, if not kind. You imagine. Then, the orphan, 8 years old, maybe 9, curled under a too-thin blanket in a dormitory filled with soft, sad breathing. She's scared, not of monsters, but of mornings. The bell, the chores, the endless repetition. Sleep, for her, is the only thing that feels private, even if it's shared. Or the prisoner, a man convicted of stealing bread, lying on his cot, hands crossed over his chest, staring at the ceiling. He's tired, but sleep won't come. There's too much noise, too much guilt, or maybe no guilt at all, just the heavy, itchy silence of injustice. And yet, amidst these strict walls, people still dreamed. They found ways. Some made sleep rituals from nothing, folding their coats just so, saying the same phrase 3 times, humming under their breath when no one was listening. Others snuck in scraps of comfort, a threadbare toy, a pressed flower. One man carved the Lord's Prayer into the underside of his bed frame, believing that the weight of the words would ease his dreams. You glance at your own surroundings now. Your room may be modest, but it's yours. Your blanket, your slightly burnt tea, your onion, still faithfully nearby. And yet, you feel a kinship with those sleepers, because at some point, we all try to make peace with the night, whether in silken sheets or scratchy uniforms. We all chase rest in the same way, slowly, softly, hopefully. You recall a line from an old report on asylum conditions, dated 1858. The inspector wrote, "Sleep is the only moment when all are equal. For even the mad know the comfort of a dreamless hour." That line stays with you, because here you are, equal to them in this one-way body slowing, thoughts loosening, surrendering just a little more to the dark. The rain is soft again, the silence deeper. Even the shadows seem to yawn. Sleep may still be elusive, but here in this room, in this story, it's no longer lonely. The stillness is almost complete now. Even the rain, once a steady companion, has become little more than a suggestion. A faint tap here, a delicate streak across the window there. You could almost imagine it was never raining at all, only your mind echoing its own gentle rhythm into the dark. The fire is out, the coals are cold, but somehow you feel warmer now than before. You sink deeper into your blanket, the wool clinging with familiar weight, and your thoughts, slow and syrupy, glide towards something that always seemed so far out of reach in the city fresh air. Stars, crickets, unpaved ground beneath bare feet. Tonight, you let your imagination travel where many Victorians went when sleep proved evasive the countryside, because for all the potions and powders and tightly scheduled remedies of the urban world, there remained a deep belief that true sleep lived somewhere else entirely, in fields, forests, and quiet estates far from coal smoke and carriage wheels. The country was to the weary Victorian a cure in itself. Doctors advised it often. Take the air, they'd say. A fortnight in the country, a dairy cure, a rest beneath trees, no newspapers, no clocks, and above all, no London. Historians still debate how effective these rest cures truly were. Some claimed miraculous recoveries from exhaustion, melancholy, and the ever-fashionable diagnosis of nervous prostration. Others returned with little more than sunburn and mosquito bites. But what they all agreed on was this: the countryside had something cities lacked: stillness. You imagine arriving at such a place, your carpet bag slumping in your hand, breath caught in your throat at the sight of open fields. The air smells like wet grass and horses. The sky, free from soot, stretches wider than you thought it could. You're shown to a small guest room in a manor house. There's a pitcher of fresh milk on the nightstand. The bed smells faintly of lavender. There's a quilt, hand-stitched, heavy in a comforting way. You're told to eat early, to walk after supper, to listen to the wind in the hedges and the hoot of the night birds. And then you are to rest. No street lamps here. No clock faces glaring from a dozen chimneys. Just the moon and a soft knock from the housemaid who leaves a hot brick wrapped in flannel at your feet. You slide under the covers. You close your eyes. You listen. And still, maybe, you can't sleep, because even in paradise, the mind is a stubborn thing. But here, you at least have space. You can get up, wrap a shawl around your shoulders, and step outside without fear. And in doing so, you discover what many Victorian insomniacs did. There is something calming about the sound of sheep breathing, about the gentle rustle of corn stalks, about the velvet shadow of a cow shifting in its pen. Country estates often kept records of the sleep quality of their guests, especially those there for convalescence. One such logbook, discovered in Devon, lists entries like, July 3rd, Mr. reports improved slumber after evening stroll near the south hedgerow. July 6th, Miss F. slept 9 hours, credits warm goat's milk and robin song. And then, curiously, July 9th, Mr. L. awoke at midnight, restless. Claims owl stared at him with knowing expression. Sleep, it turns out, was not guaranteed even among the brambles and birds, but the effort to find it was always gentler, less fraught. Here, sleeplessness wasn't seen as weakness, but as sensitivity. You weren't broken. You were attuned to the night. You think of the other rustic cures, lying on a hay bale in a barn, eating apples before bed, drinking warm water with mint leaves and crushed gooseberries. One country doctor even recommended gazing steadily at the moon's reflection in still water, a poetic, if damp, prescription. And then there were the animals. It was said that sleeping near a dog promoted restful dreaming. Cats were more mysterious. Some swore they stole breath. Others believed they guarded it. Horses, meanwhile, were thought to radiate calm if you sat in the stable long enough. You smile at the image someone curled up beside a dozing horse, both of them gently snoring. As the stars blinked above, there's a story you remember, passed down in a faded diary. A gentleman who claimed that the only thing that helped him sleep was the sound of cows chewing. Every summer, he'd visit his cousin's farm, drag a stool to the barn, and sit for an hour at dusk, eyes closed, listening to the slow, methodical chewing of a contented herd. He called it the ruminant lullaby. You can almost hear it now. The rhythmic, rubbery squelch. It's not exactly musical, but it is dependable. You feel your breath start to mirror it. Slow, even, satisfied, out here in this imagined country night. Even the wind has softened. It doesn't whistle like it does in town. It whispers, low and leafy, like a lullaby that forgot its tune but remembered the feeling. The country isn't always quiet, but it's a different kind of noise. A gentler static, less intrusive, more alive. You picture the old estates and cottages of the era, nestled in the hills, each with its own sleep habits and traditions. Some families sang hymns before bed. Others rang small bells to mark the end of the day. In one village, it was customary to walk barefoot on dewy grass before turning in, to let the day's worry drain through the soles. You wiggle your toes now, as if they might remember what that feels like. And then you're back in your little room, blanket curled around you, onion still keeping vigil, rain returning in soft, uneven drips. But the air feels cleaner somehow, the ceiling taller. You brought something back with you from the countryside, not just the idea of sleep, but the permission to rest. No shame, no schedules, just softness, a countryside of the mind, open fields. Inside your chest, you breathe in deep. You let it go. You sleep. Not because you must, but because you can. The rain is more of a presence than a sound, now a texture, like silk brushed over the outside of the house. It settles into the cracks of the roof and pools in quiet corners outside the window. You've stopped counting the drops. You've stopped trying to track time. The air is still. The world has narrowed, and your thoughts continue to soften, folding inward like petals at dusk. You are quite pleasantly drifting, and then a stray thought perks up, one of those odd ones that floats to the surface when you're not paying attention. What else did the Victorians try? Not just potions or countryside retreats or moral contortions, but actual devices. Ah, yes, Victorian sleep gadgets. A niche market, to be sure, but a remarkably inventive one. And sometimes, frankly, a little bit terrifying. You picture a cluttered workbench in a dimly lit workshop. Gears, springs, leather straps, the air thick with sawdust and candle wax. A mustached inventor tinkering late into the night, not because he can't sleep, but because he wants to make sure you can. Victorian mechanical sleep aids ranged from the charmingly absurd to the "you're not putting that near my face" variety. One of the most well-known was the sleep cradle, a chair that gently rocked you back and forth at set intervals, clockwork powered. Of course, it looked like something between a baby swing and a torture device, but it was praised in several periodicals as a relaxing substitute for opium. Some even came with built-in music boxes. The same lullaby played over and over. You'd hope it helped you sleep before you were tempted to dismantle the thing with a fireplace poker. Another favorite, the weighted nerve harness. Yes, really. This device was strapped across your chest and shoulders and claimed to realign your nervous energies through moderate compression. In theory, it mimicked the soothing pressure of a hug. In practice, it made you feel like a mildly anxious sandwich. Historians still debate whether these inventions were sincere efforts or simply capitalizing on public desperation. After all, people will try nearly anything at 200 a.m. when their minds refuse to quiet down. Then there was the nighttime eye adjuster, a mechanical band worn like a crown, with two padded arms that lightly pressed your eyelids closed. Imagine falling asleep with tiny velvet fingers holding your eyes shut. One reviewer described it as gentle at first, then oddly persuasive, more practical, perhaps. Were the automated sleep timers, candle-holding devices designed to extinguish the flame after a set period. One even came with a water-dunking mechanism that gently dropped a thimble of water onto the wick, leaving a soft hiss in the air. A Victorian sleep sound, if you will. And then there were the breath pacers, small wooden boxes with a swinging pendulum you were meant to watch and sync your breathing with. Slow inhale, slow exhale. The hypnotic tick-tock matched your breath until, supposedly, sleep tiptoed in. You imagine lying there, blanket to your chin, staring at a brass pendulum with increasingly heavy eyelids. It might just work. Or you might start naming it and giving it backstory, which is also strangely soothing. There were even sleep bells, tiny chimes set on timers, meant to ring softly every hour to encourage dream recall. The idea was that if you could wake just enough to remember your dreams, you'd feel more rested. This, of course, was invented by someone who probably never had to wake at dawn and haul coal. Some devices, on the other hand, were less about mechanics and more about method. One popular tool was a dream pillow. A sachet stuffed with dried herbs like hops, rose petals, thyme, and even wormwood. The smell was meant to lull you into restful dreams. Recipes varied widely. Some included crushed seashells, others ash from a burned Bible verse. You'd sleep with it under your head and hope for visions instead of sneezes. There was also a short-lived trend involving zebra wood headboards, believed to emit a soothing, etheric resonance that promoted calm. Unsurprisingly, the furniture makers were the ones who mostly promoted this claim, and yet, for all the peculiar gadgetry, there's something deeply human in all of it. You see people trying to fix something they didn't quite understand, using the only tools they had: brass, wood, fabric, herbs, and hope. You think about the modern equivalents: sleep masks with built-in Bluetooth, white noise machines with faux cricket options, app-controlled beds that warm your feet just enough. Not so different, really. Just fewer springs. Back then, a sleepless person might get up, wind their breath pacer, apply a few drops of violet oil to the corner of their pillow, and sit patiently in their rocking chair, waiting for the mechanical arms to pull a blanket snug around them. It was part science, part theater, a bedtime ritual that felt more like a stage production than a medical treatment. But maybe the ritual was the treatment, because, in the end, it wasn't always about whether the gadget worked. It was about the belief that it might. That sleep was something you could chase. That you weren't powerless against your own mind. You glance now at your own nightstand. No brass pendulum, no velvet eye band, just your quiet room. A few creaks, the breath of rain, the silent, enduring onion. And maybe that's enough. You shift your position again, and this time your body doesn't protest. You've stopped reaching, stopped planning. You simply wait and breathe. The inventions have all faded into the attic of history, but you're still here. Just like the sleepers who tried them, still hoping, still human, still gently drifting toward rest. The quiet, once punctuated by the rhythmic tapping of rain, now feels total complete in its softness. Even your thoughts move slower, less like footsteps, and more like leaves floating downstream. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, but full of memories, sensations, imaginings. You're warm now, cocooned in the weight of your blanket, the air thick with that half-sleep stillness. Your eyelids flutter, heavy with dreams not yet begun. And before we carry on, hey everyone, we've reached this point. Have you drifted off to sleep yet? If you're still awake, drop a comment to let me know where you're at and how you're feeling. But if your eyes have already closed and you're resting peacefully, I hope the night carries you gently through to morning. Now, back to our gently unraveling tale. Let's drift now from the ticking gadgets and countryside lullabies into another, more refined corner of Victorian life, the upper crust, the gentry, the ones with titles and 10 fireplaces and entire rooms designated for embroidery or fainting or quiet contemplation, you might think, from all the paintings and portraits and tightly laced corsets, that they slept like angels on satin pillows. But oh, if only that were true. Victorian aristocrats had their own unique relationship with insomnia. One tangled up in status, manners, and a truly astonishing amount of monogrammed linens. In fact, not sleeping could almost be fashionable. You see, among the elite, sleep, or the lack of it, was a reflection of one's delicate constitution, a sign of refined nerves, a fragile mind, something to be spoken of with soft concern over breakfast, perhaps with a gloved hand resting gently on the temple. I'm afraid I hardly slept at all last night. Lady Featherstone might sigh over her tea. The moon was simply too bold. Historians still debate how much of this was genuine sleeplessness and how much was cultivated elegance. After all, nothing said aristocratic suffering quite like claiming that you were kept awake by poetry, piano sonatas, or the memory of a garden party long past. These were not people who chewed onions before bed or stuffed hay into mattresses. No, their cures were curated, personal, involving rare flowers, imported teas, and sometimes entire rooms dedicated to the art of unwinding. Some had sleep salons, yes, actual rooms designed for pre-bedtime repose. These were filled with overstuffed chairs, perfumed sachets, and hired musicians who played very soft things on very expensive instruments. Imagine a man in a waistcoat playing Chopin on a harp while your maid brushes your hair precisely 100 times. And then there were the night letters. The upper class adored correspondence, and many preferred to write late at night, after the house had gone quiet, and the only light came from an oil lamp flickering by the ink pot. These letters intimate, florid, sometimes deeply rambling, were filled with thoughts deemed too delicate for daylight. I find sleep difficult lately. One baroness wrote to her cousin, I think perhaps it is the strain of balancing the estate ledgers, or possibly the chandelier in the drawing room is slightly askew. Both are intolerable. You smile at that, because it's so perfectly theatrical, but beneath the drama was something real, a loneliness, a kind of mental drift that touched even those with silk sheets and personal footmen. You might have 10 servants, but when sleep escapes you, it doesn't matter how many times your slippers have been polished. The mind is still the mind. Some aristocrats developed elaborate sleep routines. They believed, often with great sincerity, that their blood needed to settle before they could sleep. This meant reclining at a certain angle, drinking a specific wine not too sweet, and reading precisely 14 pages of something French and mildly melancholic. Others insisted on white noise, not the kind you're used to, but the rustle of leaves outside a conservatory window, or the distant sound of owls. One earl reportedly imported frogs from Italy, just so he could hear them croak at night. He said it reminded him of childhood. His neighbors were not amused. There were, of course, more serious cases. Insomnia rooted in anxiety, grief, or chronic illness. Queen Victoria herself was famously restless in the years following Prince Albert's death. Her journals, thick and ornate, are filled with entries about nights spent awake in sorrow, watching the firelight flicker across empty halls, and still she ruled an empire. Sleep, for the elite, was complicated. It was both necessary and indulgent. To sleep too soundly might suggest a lack of depth. To sleep too little might imply a troubled mind. It was a balance, a performance, and so they crafted their cures accordingly. A bit of warm sherry, a servant reading aloud from the Psalms, a slow walk beneath the stars, followed by lavender-watered handkerchiefs and a final glance at a miniature portrait of someone long dead. You think now of one such scene, a woman in a four-poster bed, candles flickering, her lace nightcap perfectly in place. She lies still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Not because she's anxious, not because she's waiting, but because this moment of silence, of not being expected, is the only time that feels like hers. She'll sleep soon, or not. Either way, she'll rise in the morning, put on her bodice, and whisper something poetic about the moon to the maid. You shift under your blanket, cozy in your less than royal setting. No harpist, no owls, no footman waiting outside the door with a hot stone wrapped in flannel. Just you, the quiet, the onion, and in some strange way, the comfort of knowing that even those who had everything still wrestled with the same stubborn, fluttering edge of sleep. You exhale slowly, not quite a sigh, more like the beginning of a very good dream. You stir again, just slightly. A sleepy nudge deeper into the folds of your blanket. The air has a coolness now, not cold, but fresh, like the faintest breeze has tiptoed through the room and decided to stay a while. Somewhere outside, a drain trickles with rainwater. Inside, everything is still. Your thoughts, quiet and rounded, roll slowly into the next chapter of our strange and gentle story when the night stopped being dark. Tonight, we step softly into the flickering moment when the Victorian world welcomed electricity and sleep. That age-old companion began to shift. Before the bulb, darkness was a given. Sleep came when the sun fell, and the world followed. Candles flickered, gas lamps hissed, but the night still belonged to silence, to starlight, to rest. But once electricity slithered its way into the city, one glowing street lamp at a time, everything changed. Historians still debate exactly when the balance tipped, but by the 1880s, with arc lights and filament bulbs spreading like gossip across London and beyond, nighttime was no longer sacred, no longer untouchable. It became optional, and sleep. It began to flinch. You imagine a man in 1879, standing on a cobbled street under the first electric lamp. He squints up at it, hand raised to shield his eyes. It buzzes slightly, bright, unnatural, almost smug. The lamp doesn't flicker like gas. It beams. It glares. It does not apologize. He's impressed, sure, but also unsettled, because the dark, once his cue to begin slowing down, has betrayed him. Now it's bright as morning, and he's not quite sure when to go home anymore. At first, electricity was limited to the wealthiest neighborhoods and the most modern businesses, department stores, hotels, theaters. But those were precisely the places that began staying open later. Theaters began scheduling shows at 9:00 p.m. Shops gleamed well past sunset. Dinner parties stretched longer. And people drawn like moths to novelty began to linger. The body, however, hadn't gotten the memo. Sleep came as it always had when the mind stilled, when light fell away, when silence draped the world. But now, that silence was competing with longer hours, brighter rooms, and, eventually, the hum of new machines, electric clocks, electric tea kettles, electric doorbells, all of them nibbling at the edges of the night. Some welcomed the change. Sleep, after all, had long been wrapped in rules and restriction. Now, with light on demand, people could read later, work later, think later. Others, though, began to suffer. Doctors noticed a rise in urban restlessness. Patients reported minds that refused to quiet. Children stayed awake longer. Women, whose delicate nerves were already considered unstable, were warned against exposure to too much electric light. It was said to make the skin pale and the eyes troubled. One 1892 pamphlet claimed that over-illumination caused mental chatter and unwelcome wakefulness. The proposed solution: a new product called Noctura Glass tinted lenses for indoor use, meant to soften electric light. Think of it as the world's first blue light filter. You imagine someone slipping them on, peering at the room through rose-colored glass, hoping the shadows will return, hoping their body will remember the cues it once trusted. Sleep, you see, had always been governed by light. Sunsets told our ancestors it was time to rest. Moonlight gently allowed exceptions. Candles offered extension. But electricity ignored the conversation altogether. And so the Victorian sleep cycle began to stretch. Instead of bed at 9, people now found themselves awake at 10, 11, even midnight. Some loved it. The world had grown. There was time for art, for invention, for gossip, for introspection. Others resented it. The night had once been a place of refuge, where you could disappear into dreams. Now, it asked for performance, activity, presence. You think now of a young woman, perhaps in 1893, seated by her dressing table in a modest London flat. She's lit her room with a new electric lamp, gifted by a cousin who works in the city council. It makes her feel modern, important. She stays up reading letters, rearranging her hairpins, sketching in her diary, but when she finally climbs into bed, something's off. The shadows are different. The silence is shallower, and the sleep that once waited behind the curtain is late. She'll drift eventually, but she'll do so with more effort than before. And in the morning, she'll yawn over her porridge and wonder if maybe she liked gaslight better. Not all resisted. Some men, the inventors, the engineers, the newspaper editors praised the light. They wrote articles about the future of productivity, about the death of laziness. One essay even declared that electric light would cure the working man of sloth. You chuckle softly at that, because now we know what they did in productivity isn't the enemy of sleep. It's its shadow. One chases the other, endlessly. You shift slightly in your blanket, reminded that your own world is still lit just differently. Screens instead of arc lamps, LEDs instead of gaslight. But the story is the same. We tried to control the night, and sleep, ever polite, stepped back, but not too far, not forever, because no matter how bright we make the room, the body still craves the dark, still listens for the hush, still responds to rain on windows and the quiet flick of a page. You take a deep breath now, in through the nose, out through the lips. The light has faded again, just as it always does. And here, in this space, free of glare, free of demands, you are allowed to rest, without worry, without expectation. The world may be brighter than ever, but you, here, are safe in the dark. The hush has become something sacred now, a silence that breathes, not empty, but full of possibility. Your body lies still, as if you've become part of the room itself. The walls seem softer, the bed heavier, the ceiling more distant. The rain outside is barely audible, just a misting hum lost in the eaves. And yet, the atmosphere holds. It's in this deepening calm that you begin to imagine something a little unexpected, something soft and velvet draped, and strangely modern for the 19th century. You're about to drift into the world of Victorian sleep parlors and nap salons. Yes, you heard that right. While most of us picture Victorian London as either grimy workhouses or overstuffed drawing rooms, there existed a curious middle space, the gentle, faintly theatrical realm of paid rest. At the height of Victorian nervousness, and it really did have a height, a wave of rest establishments began popping up in the busier quarters of the city, designed to cater to the overscheduled, the anxious, the fashionably drained. These were places where you could go not to work, not to drink tea, not even to be seen, but simply to rest. Imagine it now. You step off a noisy cobbled street and into a warm, quiet building. A bell tinkles faintly as the door closes behind you. You're greeted not by a clerk, but by a rest hostess, dressed in dove-gray silk, who guides you with whispered directions and gloved hands. The first room you pass is the reclining salon, filled with long, upholstered lounges, spaced just far enough apart for discretion. Each one has a tiny bell, a velvet headrest, and a side table with a small dish of barley lozenges or sugared fennel. Further in, you find the twilight chamber. This one's dimly lit, its ceiling painted to resemble a starlit sky. There's no music, but you can hear a soft rustle of leaves, a sound machine, or perhaps just a well-placed window catching the breeze. Here, people recline not to sleep fully, but to drift, half-conscious, coat folded neatly under the arm, boots unlaced, soul slightly ajar. Historians still debate whether these rest parlors were proto-spas, social experiments, or simply entrepreneurial responses to a growing market of exhausted people. Likely, they were all three. What's certain is that people used them. From bankers to governesses to well-behaved schoolboys, the parlors offered a rare indulgence in a world that prized discipline, the right to lie still. Some establishments offered dream menus. Yes, you could choose your ambiance. Would you prefer the rustic meadow setting with hay-scented pillows and birdsong piped in from a phonograph? Or perhaps oriental garden with silk drapes, incense, and soft instrumental tunes played from behind a screen. Others were more clinical, medicalized sleep houses where a nurse would monitor your pulse while you rested. You weren't sick. Exactly. Just nervous. Just tired. And in Victorian London, that was almost fashionable. You picture yourself reclining now in one of those lounges, the upholstery gently giving beneath your weight. A wool blanket is folded neatly at your feet, just in case. The air smells faintly of lemon balm and something vaguely dusty, like old curtains warmed by the sun. You're not expected to sleep, but you're not expected to do anything else either. And that, in itself, is soothing. Some parlors offered tea afterward. Others gave you a small printed card certifying your visit. One read, "This certifies that the bearer has taken time to rest today and is therefore considered a person of fine judgment and commendable hygiene." The Victorians were nothing if not formal. Of course, these spaces weren't open to everyone. As with most things in that era, rest was a luxury, but they hinted at something new, an understanding that rest wasn't laziness. It was restoration. And that perhaps, just perhaps, sleep wasn't always about bedtime. Sometimes it could be found in the folds of the day. You think of the modern equivalents: nap pods in offices, meditation apps, weighted blankets, and soft playlists. We haven't changed all that much. We're still searching for sanctioned rest, permission to stop. And these Victorian sleep salons, for all their faint silliness, offered that. One writer described them as the only place in London where time slowed down without apology. He spent afternoons there, composing poetry in his head, not writing it down, just thinking in rhythm with the ticking of the parlor clock. You glance now at your own surroundings. No velvet lounges here, no barley lozenges, no dream menus, just the blanket, the low hush of rain, and your breath, steady and kind. Still, the idea of a sleep salon lingers. The thought that somewhere, someone was paid not to perform, not to produce, but to rest. And maybe you don't need a starlit ceiling or a feathered screen. Maybe this moment, this hush, this breath is enough. Maybe it's its own kind of salon. You shift again, not from discomfort, just to feel the shape of your body beneath the blanket. To notice that the air feels softer, that the room has become more of a cradle than a space. No music plays, no hostess waits, but something in you sighs. Permission granted. Rest is welcome here. You stretch, just a little one arm beneath the blanket, a soft extension of fingers, toes curling gently under wool, not enough to break the spell of sleepiness, just enough to remind your body it's still there, still yours. The room has grown so still that even your breath sounds brave. The rain, barely audible now, has slipped into the background like a respectful butler. Your eyes remain closed, or maybe they're half open, floating somewhere between. The space you inhabit is no longer just the room. It's memory, dream, thought, and tonight, that drifting current takes you somewhere even softer, even smaller. We're going to visit the world of Victorian children's sleep routines, because while adults may have had their sleep salons and nightcaps and mechanical rocking chairs, children were not spared from the culture of insomnia or the attempt to prevent it at all costs. Sleep in the Victorian child's life was both sacred and highly managed. There were lullabies and prayers, yes, but also rules. So many rules. The belief at the time was that the habits you formed in early childhood would set the tone for your entire adult moral character. If you learned to sleep properly, you'd grow into a composed, obedient, God-fearing citizen. If not well, the consequences were dire laziness, nervous fits, melancholy, or, worst of all, disobedience. Historians still debate how much of this was genuine medical concern versus a desire to exert control. But regardless, bedtime in the nursery wasn't always the carefree hour we like to imagine. You picture it in a small child in a long cotton nightshirt, standing stiffly by the fire while a governess brushes her hair. 100 times, each stroke a quiet command. The room is tidy, a basin of cooling water in the corner, a copy of Little Goody Two Shoes closed neatly on the chair. Bedtime begins with inspection. Fingernails, socks, ears. Cleanliness was next to godliness, but also, apparently, essential for restful sleep. Then came recitation, a Bible verse, a poem, or a list of good deeds done that day. Some families kept a virtue book where children could log their behavior and be rewarded with a longer story or an extra kiss on the forehead, and finally, the child would be tucked in arms at sides, eyes up at the ceiling, quilt pulled just so. The candle would be extinguished with a soft puff, and the door would close, and then they would lie awake, because children, like adults, are curious creatures. Sleep does not always come on command. No matter how many apples you refused at dinner, or how tightly your hands are folded, some lay there imagining sea voyages. Others counted sheep, though one governess insisted on counting daisies instead. As sheep were thought to excite the brain, there were lullabies, of course. Some gentle, some strange. One popular cradle song went, "Go to sleep, my little mouse, in your tidy, quiet house. If you stir or make a peep, the chimney sweep shall steal your sleep." A little ominous, perhaps, but effective. Other children were read to softly, methodically, from books designed not to entertain, but to induce sleep through boredom. Tales with titles like "The Clock with No Hands," "The Longest Walk to Church," or "Polly and the 7 Loaves of Bread." Some books were designed to be so repetitive and uneventful that even the most curious minds would slowly surrender. You could almost hear the drowsy narrator, voice dipping lower with each paragraph, until even the reader nodded off. And yet, for many Victorian children, sleep wasn't guaranteed, especially in less affluent homes, where several siblings might share a single bed or sleep head to toe to conserve warmth. Privacy was rare, and so was silence. Parents returning late from work, babies crying in the next room, neighbors shouting through the walls. Still, even these crowded rooms held bedtime rituals. A song hummed, a hand rested on a shoulder, a final whispered joke that made someone giggle under the covers. One child's diary from 1885 contains the entry, "We slept 6 in the bed tonight. My feet were warmest. Mary snored like a train. Mama said it meant she'd grow taller." And you think what a beautiful, messy, human version of bedtime, even in wealthier nurseries, where nurses enforced stillness and strict sleep times. Children found ways to reclaim the night. Whispered games beneath the blankets. Secret codes tapped on bed frames. A flashlight made from stolen candle stubs. Sleep came eventually, but not always from structure. Sometimes it came from the comfort of knowing someone else was there. You think now of your own quiet space. No sibling sharing your blanket. No governess reciting rules. Just you, here, floating gently in the slow tide of the night. And yet, something about those shared beds, those whispered lullabies, still lingers. A kind of warmth that isn't physical. A connection. You smile, almost imperceptibly, because in the end, all children wanted the same thing then as now. Not perfection, not sleep on command, just a safe place to close their eyes. And you too are safe here. Let the night fold over you, like a mother tucking in the corners, smoothing the quilt, whispering one last line before she leaves the room. Sleep well, The daisy clock is ticking. You shift again. But this time, not out of restlessness. It's the kind of movement sleep makes when it's almost there. A soft repositioning. A final settling. Your limbs feel heavier now. Weighted not by weariness, but by calm. Even your thoughts tread gently, like slippers on old wood floors. You've followed Victorian sleepers through drawing rooms, dark alleys, gardens, and parlors. You've sniffed onions, dodged ticking clocks, and humored a few suspect contraptions. But now, in this second-to-last step before true rest, you find yourself back where all those stories converge. A small office, a wood-paneled room, a doctor's study. Tonight, you'll sit metaphorically, of course, with a fictional but utterly believable figure, one of the countless Victorian physicians whose advice, remedies, and well-meant nonsense filled the journals, households, and medicine cabinets of the 19th century. Let's meet Dr. Hiram Woolsey Penrose, a man of principle, punctuality, and positively too many waistcoats. You imagine his study lit by 2 gas lamps, one always flickering slightly due to a draft no one can ever seem to fix. There's a dusty anatomical chart of the nervous system pinned crookedly to the wall, a faint smell of dried mint leaves, and a suspicious jar of something floating in liquid that no one wants to ask about. Dr. Penrose considers himself a sleep expert. He's read every medical circular, published 5 letters in the Gentleman's Monthly Health Monitor, and owns a monogrammed silver case just for valerian root lozenges. And his advice? Oh, he has plenty. He believes insomnia falls into 5 categories. Insomnia of the stomach, insomnia of the moral temperament, insomnia brought by improper linen, insomnia due to lunar agitation, and most distressing, the wandering wakefulness, which he describes as a mental form of foot rot. Historians still argue whether any of this was taken seriously or whether Dr. Penrose just really liked naming things. Either way, he had treatments ready for each. For insomnia of the stomach, chew a clove soaked in vinegar while lying on your left side. For improper linen, change immediately into nightclothes made of cool but morally acceptable fibers. For lunar agitation, avoid moonlight at all costs, especially near reflective surfaces. He once scolded a patient for keeping a silver teapot near the bed. For wandering wakefulness, write your most embarrassing memory in longhand before bed. Then burn it using a single match, preferably struck with your eyes closed. And yet, behind all his grand gestures and rattling Latin phrases, Dr. Penrose is kind. He believes sleep is a right, not just a necessity. He sits patiently with his patients, never rushing them out the door. He always says the same thing after prescribing his odd routines. You may not sleep tonight, but you'll feel seen. And sometimes that's enough to begin. He's not wrong. Sometimes it's not about the lavender pillows or the sugarless tea. Sometimes it's just about being reminded that others lose sleep too. That your restlessness isn't a failure, it's part of being alive. Dr. Penrose has strong opinions on bedtime stories. He believes adults should be read to just as often as children. The imagination must be cradled, he insists, or else it wriggles all night like a cat beneath the bed sheets. He's also an advocate for boring narratives, sleepy tales, he calls them. Ones that loop gently, ones that don't ask for anything. Just stories that are there, drifting beside you, waiting, rather like this one. You imagine sitting across from him, sipping tepid barley tea, as he reads softly from a file of collected sleep testimonials. His voice is warm, if a bit nasal. His spectacles slide down his nose as he recites. Mrs. H, aged 42, reports restful sleep after removing brass buttons from her cuffs and substituting wooden toggles. Claims the guilt of military fashion was weighing on her dreams. Miss T, age 29, insists that picturing his neighbor's goose walking through a hedge maze helped him forget his overdue tax records. Miss L, age 17, began sleeping more soundly after being allowed to wear her hair loose at night instead of braided into a symbol of domestic restraint. You smile. You can't help it. And just when you're about to drift off for good, Dr. Penrose leans in and says his parting line, the one he always saves for the end of a consultation. You've done your part. Now let sleep do hers. The gas lamp flickers again. The shadows pull back. You feel your body sink, ever so slightly, like a feather deciding where to land. There are no more remedies tonight. No more charts. No more diagnoses. Only you. And the dark. And the soft promise of sleep not guaranteed, but patiently waiting. Because even in the face of clocks, of onions, of wandering minds, something in you still knows how to rest. You just needed the room, the hush, the voice, and maybe, just maybe, the very silly doctor with the velvet-lined prescription pad who never once told you to try harder. And now, we've arrived. You're deeper than before, deeper than you've likely realized. Your breath, slow and quiet, barely makes a sound. Your limbs lie still, not from effort, but from peace. Even your thoughts, those usual midnight wanderers, have curled up into something like sleep's waiting room. This is the final step, the last soft turn in the hallway before dreams begin. But before we fully let go, hey everyone, we've reached this point. Have you drifted off to sleep yet? If you're still awake, just drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling or where you're listening from. And if you're already sound asleep, then I hope this journey has carried you gently without ever asking too much of your tired mind. We'll end now, not with answers, but with the quiet confidence that you don't need them. The rain has nearly stopped. It leaves behind a sheen on the glass, a slow drip from the eaves, a faint scent of damp stone. The world outside has grown even softer, as if the weather itself is winding down, unbuttoning its coat and settling into something slower inside. The fire is long gone, the embers now just charcoal, sleeping in their little nest of ash. You're warm though. You've made it through clocks and cures, stories and silliness. onions and opium, and more advice than any reasonable person should absorb before bed. But you did, quietly, without resistance. You think, if barely, about the Victorians, about all those long ago sleepers, scattered across cities and fields and institutions, some in feather beds, some on hay, some on cold boards. All of them chasing the same thing, sleep. They watched flames, drank lettuce water, swallowed odd pills, and whispered stranger prayers. They built devices and held superstitions, and sometimes they just sat quietly, waiting. They hoped, as you hope, for that release. And now you realize something. Maybe sleep doesn't always come like a gift handed to you with certainty. Maybe it arrives like this quiet, uncertain, shy. Maybe it doesn't need to knock. Maybe it just waits for you to notice you've already let go. You lie still, not frozen, not tense, just still. And the onion, still sitting useless but loyal on your table, is there with you. A slightly ridiculous symbol of this entire journey. But you smile. Or you would. If your face weren't so peacefully slack now, because you understand the point of it all. We try. We arrange pillows. We dim lights. We put on stories like this one. Not because they guarantee sleep, but because they give it a place to arrive. And tonight, it just might. The room fades. You think you hear something, a voice, a memory, a footstep in an empty hallway. But it's not real. Or it is. And it doesn't matter. Everything that matters is here. The blanket, the hush, the darkness with no edges, the long, slow exhale that means nothing more needs to happen. And now, dear friend, we let the last thought pass. We let the room dim. We let the story close. And we let sleep, if it hasn't already, wrap around you like warm fog across a still field. Let go now. No more clocks. No more voices. No more wondering if tonight will be different. It already is, because you've stayed with the story. You've moved slowly, like a leaf floating downstream. And now, there's nothing left for you to do. Just breathe in, gently, like the soft draw of a curtain, out, like the night wrapping around a house. Every sound has softened now. The rain, the creaks, even your thoughts. They no longer demand your attention. They drift past, like boats in the mist, real, but quiet. This moment belongs to stillness. You don't need to go back over the story. Don't rewind. Don't rethink. Everything you needed has already arrived. There's a comfort in knowing that people have always tried to sleep, that across time and language and culture, we've all yearned for the same thing, peace in the dark. So maybe tonight, you sleep not because you must, but because you may. And if not sleep, then rest. Deep and honest. Let your body be heavy. Let your face be soft. Let your mind do nothing at all. No thoughts to fix. No breath to control. No rhythm to match. Just the quiet. You're safe. You're still. You're already halfway to dreaming. And now, as the room fades into something softer than memory, sleep well. Oh, sleep gently. Sleep long